Hello everyone, is Bringonthechaos Glizzy for another What If Beerus is an Olympian God of Destruction? What will happen to this world?
Olympian God of Destruction. Chapter 6, Thanksgivings and Freedom. On the Isle of Crete. In what seemed to be no time at all after evaporating from the crumbling hide of the Titan's stronghold, countless particles of light suddenly emerged. All of which quickly gathered and coalesced within the entrance of a cave, and less than a second later, the physical bodies of the entire group of deities reformed. The light particles they'd once been reduced to immediately fading away as the collective feet of the 7 children of Kronos and Rhea, as well as the Oceanid, landed softly on the ground as though they'd all simply taken a light hop in the air. Rather than just coming off a massive drop from a mountain so large it pierced into the heavens themselves. In fact, if it hadn't been for the immediate expressions of relief that came over most of the gathered gods that clutched onto the duo of Zeus and Metis, one wouldn't have been able to tell anything out of the ordinary had even occurred. Well, Poseidon started, exhaling a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding as he and the rest let go of Zeus and Metis. That was an experience. Way to state the obvious, Poseidon. Hera scoffed with a roll of the eyes, earning an annoyed look from her younger brother that she completely ignored. Where are we, exactly? Hades asked with a gruff, but polite tone as he took a glance around, as did Beerus beside him. We're in the cave I was raised in up to now. Zeus replied earnestly, as he saw the rest of his siblings take a look around their surroundings as well. It may not be much, I admit, but it's cloaked by a magical veil that conceals our presences, which will make it impossible for our father to detect us. Cloaked by a magical veil, huh? Beerus repeated curiously, taking a glance over at the entrance to the cave. Now that he focused a bit more, he could certainly feel some kind of protective aura that seemed to coalesce around the cave they were in. Is that your doing? No, it isn't. Metis shook her head, earning Beerus's gaze. The magical veil of protection is Gaea's work. She alone is one of the few capable of blocking Kronos' all-seeing gaze atop his throne. All-seeing gaze. Beerus almost snorted. There hadn't been anything all-seeing about that bastard from what he'd saw. Just a pathetic old man who'd made the grave mistake of getting on his shit list. Then again, and perhaps he might be giving her too much credit here, but Metis didn't strike him as the type to exaggerate. Especially since she'd just delivered on her word in her and Zeus getting him here. Perhaps that meant that Kronos had a special sort of throne somewhere in that castle that allowed him such a thing. It wasn't hard for him to believe such a thing if it was the case. Not that it'll do him any good against me regardless. He can gawk down from his ivory tower at my movements all he likes. It won't save him from my wrath. Well, you weren't lying to us at least. Hera said matter-of-factly, giving a somewhat thankful, curt nod to Metis. The Oceanid returned the gesture with a more relaxed smile now that they were out of the line of fire. But of course. I would never even consider bluffing about my abilities in a situation like that. Nor would I. Zeus added. And you both have our gratitude for that. Hestia smiled warmly, getting a nod of agreement from Demeter beside her. And speaking of gratitude, she began, her smile broadening as she looked over at her twin brother and quickly made over to him in a few short strides. Her gait catching Beerus's attention right as her breath was close enough to tickle his skin, as she slinked her arms around the taller man's waist in a loving embrace. The top of her head barely reaching up to his chin as she rested her face against his broad chest. More than anything else, brother, I truly appreciate all the effort you went through to get us out of there. We all do. Beerus blinked as he was taken mildly by surprise with the affectionate act, though he quickly recovered from it. Any awkwardness he may have felt still getting quickly washed away by Hestia's comforting aura that blanketed over him yet again, and by extension the rest of their little abode to a lesser extent. The same pleasant feeling that had come over him the first time she'd done this resurging, and he welcomed it with open arms. "She's right, you know," Demeter added, briefly catching Beerus's eye as she flashed him a warm, thankful smile. "Our escape was only possible because of you. You're our savior, Beerus, and for getting us out of that horrible place, I can't thank you enough." "Hey, savior huh?" Beerus chuckled. "I've never been called that one before." He'd been called many things in the past, and sparsely little of them were pleasant outside of his former station as the God of Destruction. Most done behind his back when the mortals of his previous universe thought he wasn't listening. He had to admit, being complimented like that earnestly without the typical fear he'd come to expect back in his halcyon days in Universe 7 was a rather nice change from what he'd gotten used to prior. Only possible because of him. Zeus couldn't help but feel a small bit of annoyance at that statement. After all, he and Metis were seconds away from getting Kronos to drink that specially brewed potion, which would have had the Titan Lord puking his siblings out within no time had his brother chosen not to do what he did. Given the distraction this would have caused, their escape under that plan would have very well been much less stressful than it had ended up being, even if their escape from the castle would have taken longer. Metis, he could tell just from a glance, was irked by that statement as well given the effort she'd gone to in order to brew a magical potion strong enough to debilitate even Kronos, and in mapping out all the routes of the castle for escape. Regardless, she seemed to let it go quick without a word, seeing as they had all gotten out either way at the end of the day. Zeus chose to do the same in this instance despite that irking him. After all, they had indeed all gotten away from the Titan's lair without any serious harm, which had been the point of his and Metis' excursion in the first place. How it went down mattered little so long as they did. Now wasn't the time to be petty. He could ponder on how his eldest brother had managed to do what should have been impossible by amassing such power while trapped inside their father later. They had time to relax right now. It'd be unwise not to take it. It's fine. Beerus Inevitable replied to both his sisters with a grin, willingly circling his own arms around Hestia as he basked in the warmth and content that his twins somehow managed to exude so infectiously and effortlessly. A far cry from the initial awkwardness he'd held when they'd first properly interacted several weeks ago in the pit of Kronos' revolting stomach. His remaining annoyance at not being able to get immediate vengeance upon the Titan Lord abating as well rather swiftly. "I merely did as I said I was going to do," he said as he patted the shorter goddess's head with more outward affection than he'd ever shown for another person in his previous universe without making up an excuse for it or having an ulterior motive to go along with it. "And I always had faith that you would keep your promise to us," Hestia replied, snuggling a little closer into him, enough to press her impressively sized bust against his front, squishing her breasts down in the process within her tunic. Her head turned to look up at him then, with her glowing orbs shining radiantly with happiness and a beaming smile to go with it, before she leaned up and gave him a chaste kiss on the cheek. Beerus's smile morphed into a smirk as he looked down at her, letting his ego rise for a moment as they continued to hold each other. "But of course you did, Hestia. It is unwise to doubt me, after all. Only a fool would, and you are clearly the furthest thing from a fool." Just then, Beerus felt a strong hand on his shoulder, bringing his attention to the side as he saw his favorite little brother Hades grinning at him. You have my gratitude as well, brother, he said earnestly, as a slightly more feral, toothy smile graced his features. Not just for getting us out of our father's innards, but also causing that bastard as much pain as you could for all of us on the way out. Not a problem, Hades. Beerus's grin also took on a similar feral edge in response. That buffoon deserved it and so much more for the slight he made against us. And he'd get so much more just punishment as soon as he got his hands on him again. You can say that again. Poseidon nodded affirmatively. By the way, he started before looking away somewhat sheepishly when Beerus gazed over at him. I probably should have done this sooner, but I'm sorry for doubting you before, back when we were still trapped in there, I mean. Hey, it's alright. Beerus waved him off as he and Hestia finally separated from their hug. Water under the bridge now, far as I'm concerned, since you've seen the error of your ways. Speaking of doubt. Hades suddenly began, a knowing smirk plastered on his face as he turned his sights on Hera. Is there something you'd like to say to our brother as well, Hera? Hera felt her brow twitch in agitation the very second she heard his words. A frown quickly marring her beatific features as she huffed in annoyance when she caught sight of the knowing look that her younger brother was shooting her. She couldn't help but to cross her arms underneath her bosom as she narrowed her eyes defensively back at him, looking far from amused. Are you really bringing that up now, Hades? And why wouldn't I bring it up now, Hera? Hades' smirk broadened at her, his tone having some apparent smugness to it that didn't fail to immediately get on Hera's nerves. As I recall, between you and Poseidon over here, you were the most vocal about your doubt of our eldest brother being able to get us out of that rancid pit, and put his efforts down much more than he did, he said while jutting a thumb in Poseidon's direction. Not only did you call them futile, and basically call him a fool for thinking he could do it, you also had the gall to say that I needed to see the bigger picture. Never let it be said that Hades couldn't be somewhat petty given the circumstance. He hadn't forgotten about the condescending line his older sister had fed him before Beerus had eventually given her the demonstration that put her in her place. Now that they were away from their father safe and sound, it was about time she properly owned up to how wrong she was back then. And he'd make certain it was in front of all of them here and now after all that nonsense she'd spouted in their father's stomach if he could. Hera's frown had all but turned into a full-blown scowl at this point as all eyes turned to her, though given the way her divinely beautiful features contorted, it honestly looked more like a childish pout, as she looked away in annoyance. Honestly. Hades turned the side of his head to her as his hand cupped around his ear. What was that? Must you be this childish? That doesn't sound like an apology, dear sister. We're free and away from our father and his allies now, so you don't have any more excuses for not giving our brother his due respects for saving your ass. Hades snorted, bringing his hand down from his ear as he turned to gaze over fully at her with scrutiny. What, are you that embarrassed about him proving you wrong? Or is it just your wounded ego that's getting in the way? How dare you? Hera suddenly snapped at him with an outraged glare as her hands fell by her sides and balled into fists of anger, her pearly white teeth baring as her lips peeled open with an even more intense scowl, as her sublimely structured, regal cheeks tinted pink. How dare I what? Call you out to do what you should be doing anyway? Hades scoffed at her, completely unmoved by her quickly growing ire. You told me you'd get to it, remember? He reminded her of her own words from not too long ago, shortly after they'd broken out of Kronos' gut. Well, I can't think of any time better than the present to do it, do you? Hades, Hestia muttered disapprovingly. While she may have actually been in some agreement with her brother's sentiment, she was in no way on board with him putting her on the spot like this so rudely. You know what, little brother? I think you're onto something there. Beerus, on the other hand, was of the opposite persuasion. His own smirk matching Hades' own already as his sights set on his younger, and most troublesome sibling. Wait, what? Hera recoiled at Beerus's words. Her current expression of outrage being mixed in with some shock. I thought you just said it was all water under the bridge. Oh, I did. For him. Beerus also took the liberty to jut his own thumb in Poseidon's direction. Because unlike you, he has actually apologized for his error in judgment. That, and he hadn't been anywhere near as much of an abrasive nuisance to him as she had been. That was for damn certain. Hera involuntarily took a step back at that, as Beerus gently maneuvered his way around Hestia and moved closer to Hera. Hazel eyes were forced to look up and meet Amber, as the much taller of the two siblings now stood less than a foot away from Hera. His broad, muscular form looming over her much shorter, lither figure, with perhaps the smuggest, most expectant grin one could have imagined. Is this really necessary, brother? Zeus asked from his position behind Beerus now. Some concern crossing his features seeing the confrontation between his two siblings and feeling as though he should attempt to come to Hera's aid a little. Mostly because her beauty enraptured him so much that he felt the need to do so in order to try and get on her good side. Beerus, however, wasn't having any of that. Don't think I have forgotten about what you said in that castle, Zeus. He reminded without turning around. His grin remaining in place despite his words as he kept his gaze on his baby sisters. He didn't need to look back to know that that had shut his younger brother up. Given the circumstance, I'm willing to be gracious and let that slide just this once, but I'm warning you now, Zeus. Don't test me. You'll regret it, trust me. Just about everyone there, Zeus especially, could tell that he meant every word of what he'd just said simply by the edge to his tone. And after what he'd shown today especially, no one was about to be stupid enough to say he might be bluffing. The silver-haired deity swallowed involuntarily from the threat, no, the promise, of retribution if he continued to get on his older brother's bad side. The smarter part of him having kicked in quick to help avoid the potentially massive landmine he was threatening to stumble into. You understood, brother. Good. The edge in Beerus's tone seemingly vanished then, satisfied for now at his most recent little brother's concession. Now, back to the matter at hand. You said you were raised in this cave, yes? You are, yeah. Zeus nodded, his divine complexion having somewhat paled over at his brother's words. And how could they not after watching the display he'd put on in the castle? I assume that means that your caretaker or whatever still lives here too. Well, yes, she does. Then why don't you make yourself useful and fetch her for us, would you? It's quite rude to bring guests in and not introduce them, after all. You are right, Zeus had to finish rather lamely, a bead of sweat falling down his temple as he looked away with some shame before, in Beerus's mind, scurrying off further into the cave. I'll go with him. Metis decided, quickly bounding out herself, though notably much less tense than Zeus had been. I'll see you all again in a minute. She waved back at them, an action reciprocated by both Hestia and Demeter as she disappeared into the darker section of the cave. And all for someone that in all reality, Beerus couldn't have given less of a shit about meeting, but at least it got rid of Zeus being a potential nuisance. At least until later. He had a feeling his youngest brother may well end up being just as annoying as Hera could be in the future, in his own way. He could handle that later if Zeus chose to do so. For now, though, it was time to get back to getting something he actually wanted. Now then, Hera. Beerus began, bearing his full gaze down upon his sibling expectantly, as he placed his hands on his hips. I do believe there's something you have to say to me, no? Hera, for all her usual haughtiness, found herself feeling smaller underneath Beerus's gaze. Her anger having fizzled away for once within his presence alone as he looked down at her. A definite 180-degree turn from how she'd been before when they were in each other's faces prior to him having showed his strength within their former ghastly prison. She eventually found herself looking away from his unblinking eyes as her face scrunched up in mounting embarrassment, cheeks turning an even deeper shade of pink. Her hands unclenching themselves as one found purchase and gripped against her arm with some clear tension. Beerus's grin only grew seeing her nervous response. The former destroyer god of the now erased Universe 7 taking more than a little pleasure in watching the sibling that had been his greatest source of irritation during his entrapment squirm beneath his gaze. Well, I'm waiting, Hera. NGNN. Aye, Hera bit her lip. Still failing to meet Beerus's abundantly smug, leering gaze. She rubbed her arm as she struggled to actually say anything to him for once, now that he'd put her on the spot like this, and clearly wouldn't let her off until he got what he wanted off her. You what, Hera? Hades chimed in again, crossing his arms over his chest. His smile making it clear he was taking some enjoyment in watching her squirm just as Beerus was. Simply showing her she was wrong wasn't enough. After how aggravating she'd acted before, they were both long overdue to hear her verbally admit she was wrong and be humbled. It was petty and perhaps even childish for sure, but after the tone she'd taken with them, Beerus in particular, it would be a lie to suggest that this wasn't somewhat deserved. This shouldn't be difficult, Hera. All you're doing is apologizing and then thanking him for saving us. You already said you'd do the latter earlier, so what's the problem? Well said. Beerus agreed, having it affirmed in his mind yet again that Hades was his favorite brother easily. So, what are you waiting for, Hera? Go ahead. Say it. Why you, the young goddess began tersely. Over something so trivial. Are you testing me now, woman? Beerus narrowed his amber orbs, somewhat amused by her stubborn attitude even now, but all the same entirely unimpressed. I know you're not incapable of this. You've certainly had no trouble running your mouth before. Although, if you'd prefer, I'd also be willing to give you another way to show you're both apologetic and thankful to me. And what would that be? She asked, while still looking away from him. If she had been looking, she would have caught the almost Cheshire cat-like expression that came over him briefly. You can get on your hands and knees and prostrate yourself before me instead. You do that, and I'll take it as both an apology and a sign of gratitude. No words needed. What? Hera sputtered, taking a step back from the surprise of such a galling statement as she finally stared up at him almost gobsmacked. Eyes nearly as wide as saucers. Oh my. Demeter cupped her mouth in surprise, having not expected him to suggest such a provocative action. Meanwhile, Hades let out a laugh just seeing Hera's reaction, while Poseidon just stared over in some level of awe that Beerus would actually go there, knowing how prideful she already was. Beerus. Hestia called out behind him with a clearly displeased tone, as she moved forward and grabbed onto her twin's shoulder. An act that did manage to draw his gaze away from their younger sibling. Why would you even suggest such a thing? What? Beerus merely shrugged back, looking unperturbed. It's not like I'm asking for anything unreasonable from her, Hestia. It's a viable option if she can't bring herself to say anything to my face. Heck, if you ask me, I'd say it might get the point across even better than if she just said it. I am not prostrating myself to you. Hera screeched in abject defiance, her now almost shrilly voice echoing through the cave with every syllable, forcing a cringe out of everyone else there, including even Hestia despite the eldest sister's best attempt not to. Her outrage coming back full force as she glared over at her brother while balling her fists at her sides again. Though its effectiveness, if it would have had any on Beerus at all, was muted by just how red her face had become. There's no chance you're making me do that. None. I refuse to humiliate myself over something so MMPH. The increasingly loud female deity was quickly cut off before she could finish, her last words getting muffled into something indecipherable as Beerus decided to clamp one of his hands down over her mouth to stop her from screeching any further. His grin from before now long gone and replaced with an almost comically angry snarl. Damn it, Hera, are you ever gonna learn when to not screech our bloody ears off? He yelled just as loud as she'd been, forcing another cringe out of everyone there as it bounced off the walls. I was only messing with you, for goodness sake. I wasn't actually serious, you dolt. Okay, that was only half true. One side of him actually did want her to do it, purely to leave that lasting image burned into her mind, so that she may hopefully be humbled by the experience. Knowing her though, she'd probably remain just as bad. Or hell, she might actually get worse if she could hold a grudge like he could. And he had a strange gut feeling that she damn well could. Ugh, she groaned into his palm, before wrapping her hand around his wrist and managing to pull his hand away just enough for her scowl to be seen as she yelled back at him. And how was I supposed to know that, you buffoon? I can't read your mind. A buffoon, huh? Is that how you thank me for saving your ass back there? Or apologizing for the amount of crap you gave me back in that bastard's stomach? You dig your heels into the ground like a damn child and insult me. Beerus barked back, his teeth baring in an angry glower. You really are a piece of work, you know that. Oh, don't you start. Hera all but screamed in his face as she pushed herself closer, uncaring of how much she was playing with fire right now as she let her own anger take hold again. You have the nerve to call me a child while you and Hades gang up on and heckle me for a bloody thanks and apology. Oh, here we go. Beerus rolled his eyes at such an asinine statement, with Hades mirroring it in the background. You're so full of shit. We were egging you on because you were stalling over something simple and wasting our time. Oh, give over. Wasting your time. You don't have anything else to do. And I wasn't stalling either. How is calling what I asked for trivial and refusing to actually do it not stalling? Just who in the heck are you trying to fool? I never refused to do anything. She denied vehemently. At least not until now, because you know what? I don't care that you rescued us all, I'm not giving you a damn thing, you ass. Beerus growled. At this point, Hera had pushed herself up on her toes and had gotten close enough for her forehead to clash against his. Damn wench had some real nerve getting up in his face like this again. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. You really are an ungrateful cow. No, I am no. Oh, yes you are. Beerus pushed his head forward against hers, forcing Hera back immediately. Don't even try to deny it. I'm at my wit's end now with your crap, Hera. At your wit's end, huh? She scoffed, gritting her teeth as she tried to force him back in turn, but she couldn't even get him to budge a centimeter this time. As if to imply you even had any wit to begin with. Are you forgetting already that I'm the only reason you're not still in that wretched stomach? Beerus reminded with a burning fury in his eyes. Not to mention that had I not acted further you likely wouldn't have made it 10 steps out of those idiots' throne room. Hera was far from cowed. You punched our way out on both occasions, Beerus. Using brute power is hardly something that takes any real intelligence. She said this while not aware of the fact that Beerus even being able to gain the power to do those things, given what their predicament had been, should have been impossible under normal circumstances. Though even if she was, given her anger she probably still wouldn't have cared. Says the woman who did nothing but sit around with her thumb up her ass contributing nothing worth a damn. Don't stand here and talk to me about intelligence when all you've done is bitch and moan. Hera's eyes burned with a fiery fury in that moment that easily rivaled her brother's. Her teeth grinding down on themselves so hard it was a wonder they hadn't fragmented yet. To the onlookers watching on, it looked like sparks of electricity were flying between the two as they continued to butt heads. Why you? Beerus, Hera, please, you shouldn't be at each other's throats like this. Hestia said with a hand outstretched, already taking her first stride forward to be the voice of reason to her two fiery-tempered siblings. She's right, you two. There's no need for this. Demeter agreed wholeheartedly, backing up Hestia, but making no attempt to get closer and in between those two whilst they were becoming increasingly volatile. We're really back to this again, aren't we? Poseidon muttered as a sweat drop fell down his temple. It's Hera's fault, you know. If she wasn't so stupidly stubborn, then they wouldn't be butting heads like this. Hades commented by Poseidon's side while crossing his arms, making it clear he was on Beerus's side. She's really putting up this much of a fuss over having to apologize and thank him for what he's done. It's incredible to me just how short-tempered and abrasive she can be even now. I'm not so sure Beerus is all that much better in this situation, Hades. Poseidon remarked back, sagging his shoulders as he spectated on as things looked mere moments away from boiling over into a brawl. Something he was acutely aware of now that Beerus would mop the floor with her in if it did. Those two are so alike in all the wrong ways. We are nothing alike. Poseidon flinched and stepped back nervously as the two suddenly rounded on him and bellowed that out in unison, their voices booming throughout the mountain cave. The expressions on their faces looking comically pissed off and offended by the comparison. How dare you compare me to him, her? They roared, forcing the young god to break out in a fearful sweat as their ire became almost solely focused on him then. Brother. Sister. Hestia called out more forcefully this time, as her hands gripped on both of their shoulders. Please, cease your quarreling. It isn't getting either of you anywhere. The instant she said this, that same calming effect of hers from before burst forth with a vengeance, with just the two of them as its sole targets this time. Both Hera and even Beerus had to widen their eyes as it crashed over them like a tidal wave, though not in any harmful way. Quite the opposite, in fact. It enveloped them once more like a comforting blanket of warmth the likes of which neither had ever felt before. More potent in its influence on them than any time she'd done it prior. The two snapped their gazes to Hestia in that instant, as all of their anger suddenly got washed up and swallowed into the abyss. The duo's formerly tense bodies sagging somewhat as every part of their being relaxed. Their arms falling almost limply by their sides as Hera's face drained from the redness it had gained before. Come now, you two. Hestia began again, her voice coming out much softer this time. Her glowing eyes holding a softness and care to them that had both feeling somewhat guilty. You're blowing things a bit out of proportion, don't you think? But he started it, Hera pointed accusingly at her brother, though with her anger having fizzled out now, the accusation came out sounding exceedingly weak. And she knew herself how weak it sounded even as she uttered it. Started it, my ass. Get over yourself. Beerus thought to himself with an annoyed look, though that vanished as soon as it arrived when Hestia passed him a glance. Whether he did or not is irrelevant, sister. Hestia shook her head. The fact that you both could get so angry at one another over something like this is astonishing. We should be happy and continuing to celebrate how we're all free right now. Not ready to tear into each other the way you two were just now. She remarked none too proudly, which under her aura, was enough to actually make Hera bow her head slightly in some form of shame. Beerus meanwhile started to look and feel a bit sheepish. It truly does sadden me, you know, to watch my family row over nothing. I thought you two would have been past this after Beerus succeeded in getting us out and away from father, but I guess not. Hera stopped herself as soon as she had to look into her older sister's eyes again, where she could see a mixture of both disappointment and dejection as well as the same concern and worry she showed last time. Whatever remaining excuse she may have tried to muster to absolve herself crumbling then and there, leaving only the shame at how she'd been acting to bear. Beerus wasn't faring much better. Like the last time he and Hera had been arguing before Hestia broke them up, with her presence and words alone, she was able to make him regret his behavior. I'm sorry, dear sister. Hera finally said, as she looked toward the ground. Not unlike how a child would when forced to admit wrongdoing but were unable to look their parent in the eye out of shame. It looks as though I've allowed myself to become too heated yet again. I should know better. That at least, you and I both agree on. Beerus thought in agreement, but decided not to voice it at the moment, as Hera turned her gaze up to him again. And as for you, brother. She paused for a moment, as though what she was about to say was a genuine struggle for her. Eventually though, she let out a sigh as she looked away again, before continuing. I'm sorry for how I just acted towards you. I was being unnecessarily difficult towards you without a good reason. I suppose I may have gone a little overboard as well. He begrudgingly admitted when Hestia passed him her concerned glance once more. That was about as far as he went though. He may have felt bad for causing Hestia distress over his behavior again, but he sure as hell wasn't sharing that same feeling towards Hera. She would get no apology from him. If anything, she was the one who still needed to. With that said, I'll retract what I said before. Much as it pains me to admit it, you're right. Beerus stared in open surprise for once at his nuisance of a younger sister. Had she actually just said what he thought she said? Hera's cheeks blushed once again in embarrassment, and had it not been for Hestia's comforting aura, she probably would have stopped there like she had a few minutes ago. You were right, Beerus. Like everyone else here, I owe you my thanks for rescuing us. She then made a move that Beerus, in the short time he'd known her, never would have actually expected of her to initiate given how she usually was. She stepped toward him and, putting her general bitchiness to the side, she spread her arms out before circling them around his waist. Her breasts pressing against his front from within her own tunic as she hugged herself up against him and rested her head against the crook of his shoulder. Her face turned to the side as she clenched her eyes shut in heightened embarrassment. Not wanting to look up at his face to see how he reacted as her own lit up like a furnace at what she was doing. It may not have felt the same as what Hestia had given. Nor was it the prostration he'd half seriously asked for. but the gesture in and of itself spoke volumes, as it made him stiffen from the contact. Please, accept my most sincere gratitude for all that you've done for us, brother. She said earnestly, casting her pride away with some serious effort for the first time in her short life. And not to mention my apologies as well for all the hassle I gave you back in our father's stomach. I never should have doubted you. Well, I'll be damned, Hades muttered as he crossed his arms over his broad chest, whilst looking on in disbelief. She's actually showing humility. Well, color me surprised. No kidding, Poseidon remarked as both he and Demeter nodded in agreement, just as taken aback as he was. The former of which still sweating a little from when his older siblings had turned their ire on him. Beerus, meanwhile, looked utterly dumbfounded as he stared down at who had been the most antagonistic toward him. The same person who'd been bitching her ass off at him up until a moment ago, being nothing less than the total cow he'd come to see her as for the most part. And now she was hugging him closely while giving him exactly what he'd asked for. Even with Hestia's assistance in mind, that was still quite the jarring 180-degree turn compared to her normal attitude. Idly, he noted that Hestia had let go of them both at some point, and even her calming effect seemed to have sizzled out for some reason. He looked to his twin in that moment and saw that she had taken a step back from them and was smiling again, clearly happy with this turn of events. Turning his sights back to his younger sibling, he found himself not being quite sure how to respond to Hera actually being somewhat affectionate and not, well, a bitch. After a few seconds that seemed to drag on, he awkwardly decided to slowly circle his own arms around his typically aggravating sister and returned the gesture. He could feel her stiffen up like he had as he awkwardly hugged her back, but she made no attempt to move away or complain, for once. She merely just sighed again and sagged against him. As the seconds dragged on, the hug steadily became more relaxed and natural. This fact alone was enough to surprise Beerus inwardly. This is starting to feel kind of pleasant actually. Pleasant, up until now, was certainly not a word he would have used to describe any interaction with Hera. There was no denying that that was how this felt though. Now if only she could have been like this from the beginning instead of being up his ass like she'd been, he might have actually enjoyed her company. Definitely not to the same degree as Hestia, but it would have been a sore sight better than how they'd actually been. No one dared say a word in the moment. All of them, including Hades, choosing to silently watch the only wholesome act they'd ever seen between the two most short-tempered of them all. Likely because most of them knew this change of pace wasn't likely to stick. Meanwhile, it hadn't taken long for Zeus with Metis in tow to make their way through the mountain's cave. The two having walked in relative silence for the most part. The only sound that seemed to pass by having been the distant shouts that echoed throughout the cave from where they'd been. It seems as if those two have finally calmed down now. She noted upon no longer hearing the echoing outbursts of Beerus and Hera. I certainly hope so. Zeus replied with some hint of relief as they made their way down further. With the way that was going, I was beginning to worry they might actually start coming to blows. He shuddered at the thought of his impossibly beautiful sister tangoing with his eldest brother after what he'd witnessed Beerus do back at the Titan's lair. Something like that would only end ugly for her, and just thinking about that possibility made him cringe. You should be more worried about your own relationship with him, Zeus. Not his and Hera's. Because as of now, you've hardly done anything to endear yourself to him. Zeus's soon-to-be spouse remarked matter-of-factly, earning a groan from him. I'm aware of that, Metis. I kind of got the message loud and clear when he warned me not to test him. And to be honest, Zeus didn't really blame him for having a low opinion of him. The more he thought about it, if he was in Beerus's place, he wouldn't have been impressed either. He'd made an awful first impression that Beerus had let slide but was certain to not forget. He'd have to try and rectify that in the future and get in his older brother's good graces. It wouldn't do to have a schism amongst his own family and himself, after all. It was paramount that he gained Beerus's favor at some point, because if he didn't, well, he didn't even want to think about what the consequences of that would be for him going forward. Well, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you then that you'll need to get on much better terms with him. She was met with a grunt of affirmation. Good. I can do what I can to help you with that, if you want. That would be appreciated. Zeus nodded at her thankfully, glad for the offered assistance. He had a feeling he was going to need it. For now, though, let's just focus on finding Amalthea, he said before turning his attention back to their path fully. She wasn't sleeping in her usual spot inside the cave, and we haven't found her in here so far. You think she might be outside this time? I can assure you I'm not. The two heard from a number of paces ahead of them, causing them to both stop. The owner of the voice, Amalthea herself, stepping into view from the relative darkness ahead that thankfully wasn't pitch black no matter how far one walked within the cave. Another benefit given by Gear's magical veil. The naked goat nymph smiled at the two, looking more than relieved at the sight of them. I see that you two made it back, and from the racket we could just about make out from up top, I can only assume you both succeeded in your quest. Zeus smiled sheepishly right back at his surrogate mother. Ah. Well, yeah. The goal at the end of the day was still to get them out of there to safety and freedom, which they had done by aiding them in getting here. They just did nowhere near as much of the heavy lifting as they thought they would have. They both knew who was responsible for that. Wait, Zeus's mind then registered the fact that Amalthea had just said, we, instead of, I. Before Zeus could utter another word, before his and Metis' eyes, another woman with a strong maternal aura walked into view beside the goat nymph. Her brown tunic wrapped around her, with her unmistakable turret crown atop her head, and silky brown hair done up in a neat bun. Even though he had not seen her since his birth, Zeus wasn't about to forget who this woman was any point soon. A happy smile found its way to Metis' lips as she eyed the all-too-familiar Titaness. It is good to see you again, Lady Rhea. And to you both, as well. Rhea replied back with a nod and a radiant smile etched onto her indescribably beautiful face. Tears of joy already beginning to well in her eyes as she laid her gaze on the last of her 7 children. And the first of them all that she'd finally be reunited with today. Chapter 7, Family Reunion. After what seemed like a long time given how surprisingly comfortable it had gotten, but in truth was less than a minute, Hera finally pulled her arms back and made to remove herself from the embrace. Beerus made no attempt to stop her, as he let his own arms unwrap from around the shorter of the two of them and fall by his sides. Her face still a noticeable shade of pinkish red, Hera looked down at the ground and their feet. Her hands nervously clutched together just below her pelvis as she refused still to meet her brother's gaze. Are you happy now? She mutteringly asked, channeling a bit of her typically more snarky side, or at least trying to. The lack of any real bite in her tone for once was obvious. Rather than be annoyed at her given that, Beerus simply chuckled at what was possibly a shoddy attempt to save face on her end, by trying to act like she typically did around him. Her attitude really was beginning to remind him of Champa, who'd done something similar when they were young, minus the hug of course. Back then, as he always did, Beerus didn't fail to take the opportunity to tease his younger brother for a laugh. It was one of the odd ways he'd shown his affection for him whilst giving himself the plausible deniability to say that he didn't in case Whis or someone else got on his case. This time around, would be no different either. I suppose I am. He grinned teasingly, placing a hand atop her head and ruffling her long flowing chestnut brown hair into a frizz. An act that his little sister clearly didn't appreciate if the embarrassed frown was anything to go by. I'm glad that you've seen the error of your ways, Hera, but since you've retracted what you said before, I still have one thing to ask of you. And what would that be? She asked back with a light stutter, feeling the urge to slap her brother's hand away for messing with her hair so flippantly, but choosing to stay her hand for the moment. A mistake she came to regret, as Beerus gently gripped her head and leaned down, bringing himself down to eye level with her, which allowed her to see the Cheshire cat-like smile that now adorned his lips once again from the corner of her eyes. His voice a low and husky whisper that only she could properly hear. Will you be prostrating yourself to me now, or later? HRGK. Hera almost choked at that. Her face close to resembling that of the oracle fish from back on his previous residence in Universe 7 whenever he'd threatened to cut down her food supply. The sudden widening of her hazel eyes in alarm as they finally snapped to him fully, her mouth having fallen open in shock and potential horror. Instead of sweating bullets in fear, his younger sister added a personal touch of her own, by having her already blushing face turning a very dark shade of red all around. Beerus could even swear he could see actual steam pour out of her ears like some sort of kettle, as she slapped his hand away and clumsily stumbled back from him. WW what? She yelped, her usually immaculately gorgeous face resembling that of a ripe tomato. B but didn't you? Her stuttering words were cut off before she could finish as her heel knocked against a small rock behind her when she wasn't fully paying attention. Caught off, causing her to lose her footing and go off balance as she tripped over it. A startled cry leapt forth from her as she suddenly fell over onto the ground rather roughly in the next second in an undignified, near-comical manner. Her plump ass cushioning her fall as it struck the ground first. Strands of her silky, chestnut brown hair falling over her reddened face in the process. Her ample, perky E-cup breasts bouncing lively within her tunic from the impact before her hands instinctively planted themselves on the floor to steady herself, as her sizable mound settled down into a series of jiggles before stopping. Beerus, Hestia called out in bafflement, as she and others locked sights on her twin. What did you? PFFT. Before anyone else could properly react to what had just happened, Beerus's cheeks puffed out suddenly, as a number of snickers left him. Those snickers would have morphed into full-blown laughter had Beerus not decided to clamp a hand down on his mouth to stifle the laughter threatening to spill out. Hestia, Demeter, Poseidon and Hades all stared at Beerus in major confusion of what was going, as he continued to stifle laughter into his palm as he hunched over a little while his shoulders shook. His facial expression looking downright hysterical. Hera meanwhile was too stunned and red-faced on the ground to properly respond as she gaped openly at her elder sibling. All of them at a total loss for words at what had just occurred. Oh ho. A small laugh managed to escape as Beerus eventually calmed himself down, removing his hand from his lips to show the face-splitting smile he now had. That reaction was so much better than I thought it'd be, he remarked in a humored tone as he appeared to wipe a stray tear from his eye. Her reaction. Hestia muttered confusedly at her twin's remark. Beerus did not hear this however. Too focused as he was on his seated sister and how he'd got her to react. He'd expected most of what happened there, but her tripping over on herself and falling down in a heap on top of that. That was priceless. He couldn't even remember the last time something had made him laugh like that. The best he could compare this to in recent memory was that time that he, Whis and Goku had traveled to Universe 10's Kai realm and that goofball Saiyan had butchered his introduction to that cretin Zamasu. And that had only garnered a light amount of snickering from him at Son Goku's denseness. This was on a whole other level. Hera looked utterly dumbfounded right about now, and the rest of their brothers and sisters watching on in befuddlement weren't far behind her on that. Strolling closer to her with his grin still splitting his face, Beerus offered her a hand to get up. Like I said before, Hera, I was only joking. He informed without a lick of regret. No need for you to worry, I just thought I'd have a little fun messing with you, is all. Hera stared open-mouthed at the extended hand as her brother's words sank in. Once they did, if possible, her face seemed to somehow burn an even darker shade of red, as her hazel pools glared up daggers at Beerus, who had on the biggest shit-eating grin you could imagine. Her lips tracing down into what might as well have been her trademark scowl, as they peeled open to show her gritted teeth. You. Hera looked to be seething, and for a second, it looked like she was about ready to have a volcanic explosion of anger out at her elder sibling. She looked so bad that the others, outside of Hestia, almost took a step back just from the expression on her face alone. If looks could have killed, then Beerus would have been skewered like a shish kebab by now. However, to Beerus's mild surprise, and even more so to the others despite the moment of affection she'd given to him prior, his normally volatile sister managed to school her features and stop herself from doing so. Taking a few controlled breaths, her face steadily lost the deep shade of red that enveloped it before as it slowly returned to its normal, pale complexion. The indescribably beautiful woman then let out a drawn-out sigh as for once, as she managed to rein in her fury on her own without the assistance of Hestia. The first time she'd ever managed to do so. You ass. She finally said exasperatedly, as she even more surprisingly took Beerus's offered hand and used it to pull herself up. Her feminine globes of fat giving another jostle inside her open windowed tunic as she used her other hand to dust herself down. I decide to show gratitude, apologize and be nice, and that's how you respond after. Oh, give over. Beerus rolled his eyes as he let go of her hand, quickly recovering from his mild surprise as he gave her a smirk that held no actual ill will. I was just having some harmless banter with you, that's all. All in good fun. Hera's eyes were momentarily narrowed like slits upon him, clearly far from amused by his little joke. All in good fun, him. She placed a hand on her wide, shapely hip as a smirk of her own suddenly began to emerge on her pristine features. The other hand coming up to brush the stray strands of her silky, back-length hair behind her ear, as she gave Beerus a challenging look with her regal gaze. You want to mess with me for your own amusement now, do you? Well, two can play at that game, dear brother. Well then, try not to be too shocked when I get you back for that, and have some fun of my own at your expense, Beerus. Oh. Beerus rose an inquisitive, bemused brow at Hera's change of pace. Is that right? Fat chance of that happening on his watch, but still, the threat was more than a little amusing, so he might as well humor her. Good luck with that one, Hera. What'll you do? Scream your head off at me again? I'd honestly like to see you try and get me back for that. He finished while making air quotations with his hand, before placing the other atop her head again just to rile her up. his head tilting downwards to around her height in an almost condescending manner had it not been for the lack of any real bad intention on his end. Oh no. Nothing like that this time, dear brother. Rather than let him rile her so easily this time around just as she tended to do to him, Hera controlled her temperament as she placed a hand over Beerus's cheek. Her face leaning closer to his until they were barely over an inch apart, close enough for their breaths to tickle the other's skin as they stared into the other's eyes challengingly. That wouldn't get me anywhere with you and would only cause our lovely sister Hestia unneeded stress, she said while giving him a look that promised playful payback. Don't you worry, Beerus. I'll come up with something soon enough to return the favor twice as hard. It's only a matter of time. Hey, look at her, talking as if it's a foregone conclusion. Only a matter of time, she says. Ha! How adorable. It did make him just that more intrigued to see if she could actually come up with something to return his little joke twice as hard, though. Far as he knew, she had nothing to embarrass him with, so for now, no matter her confidence, it was pretty much an empty, but amusing all the same, threat. HMPH. I look forward to seeing you try. And fail most likely. Whatever botched attempt she'd make would likely be good for another laugh on his end, he'd say. Should be quite entertaining. Oh, it will be. For me that is. She countered back slyly, not backing down even an inch. You guys. Poseidon called out, getting the two's attention on him, and by extension the rest of their siblings sans Zeus as the gazes switched over. Mind telling us what that was all about? He asked with no small amount of befuddlement mirrored by the others. From the looks of things from their perspective, it had taken even less time than they would have thought before the two of them were right back in each other's grills again. Oh, nothing you need to worry about, you lot. Beerus replied, his hands coming behind him as one clasped around the wrist of the other, as he turned halfway towards the group of four. Reclining his frame back up to full height as he did. Just a bit of sibling banter, is all. Are you sure? Hestia asked concernedly, taking a step forward while clasping her hands together as she glanced over at Hera. Yes. What he says is true, sister. Said female deity gave her concerned, caring older sister a leveled smile that looked genuine. The only sign that there was something else to it being the almost predatory side glance she gave Beerus for a very brief instance. It was just a little, harmless joke he decided to pull, and one I intend to get him back for. All in good fun, though. Hestia nodded, not spotting the look Hera had sent Beerus's way as she let a kind, homely smile adorn her soft, pinkish red lips. Well, that's good, I suppose. It could end up being a way for you two to bond even further, rather than going at each other's throats. I agree. Demeter nodded in agreement with her own cautious, but relieved smile. So long as it's not harmful, it could do you some good. Better than how they were before, at least. Hades snorted to himself behind his sisters. A bemused smirk coating his bearded face as he looked between his favored brother and least favored sister, as unlike Hestia and even Demeter it seemed, he had actually noticed the look Hera sent Beerus's way. Bond isn't exactly the word I'd use there, Hestia. And doing 'em some good is a stretch from the looks of things. I wouldn't bank on 'em not being back at each other's throats soon enough with the look she just gave him. Still, he doubted it was anything Beerus couldn't handle. Not like she could overpower him and force him into an embarrassing situation like he'd just effortlessly done to her there, getting her to trip over herself like a clumsy fool. And hey, who knows? He may be wrong, and the two of them may actually get real cozy with each other in the future and start showering the other with compliments instead of insults before they became lovers or something. PFFT. Hades chuckled lowly enough that no one really heard him. Fat chance of that ever happening. The world will be flipped on its head, and I'd somehow dunk myself back in our bastard father's stomach before that ever happens. Beerus's ears suddenly perked up then, as he heard the sounds of multiple footsteps coming their way from further within the cave. Oh wait, yeah. He'd almost forgotten already that he'd sent Zeus, with Metis following, off to get that caretaker or whatever that he couldn't have cared less to meet and introduce them. Beerus leveled his gaze at the inner section of the cave just a second later, right around the point where the others started to hear the returning sets of footsteps. His eyes narrowing as they started to make out the emerging shadows from within the darkness before the others. Two of them were easy enough for him to make out as Zeus and Metis. There were another two, however, one in front and one behind, that he could not. Strange. Had Zeus failed to mention that he had more than one caretaker or something? No, that didn't sound right. Before he'd sent him off, the man had managed to get out a she, if he recalled correctly. Something that implied there was only one of them. And he doubted that had been a mistake. So, who was the fourth one? The answer came through rather quick, as the shadow in front seemed to spot them, and hastened their pace toward them, allowing Beerus to make out more of their features. Starting with the turret crown adorning their head and silky chestnut brown hair the same as Hera's down up in a bun to go with it. Then there was the dark eyes he managed to make out that widened in the steadily unobscuring shadows around them, a feminine gasp leaving their impossibly well-rounded, pale-skinned faces pinkish red lips. As if the effeminate sound wasn't enough of a dead giveaway, their approaching body was an incredibly shapely, hourglass figure of wide hips, slim waist and ample bosom held in by a brown tunic that made it abundantly clear that they were female. Hang on a minute. She looks familiar, Beerus thought to himself, as the woman fully came into the light, her eyes already welled up with unbidden tears. Wait, isn't that? Hestia gasped audibly, as hers along with everyone else's eyes landed on the new arrival. One that, though she had not seen her since the day of her birth, the eldest of the group, provided Beerus's countless years prior to reincarnation were ignored, had her eyes begin to water. Her hands clutching together as they came up to her chest in shock. Mother. The others' eyes collectively widened in shock themselves as they too recognized her, even if they'd only caught a brief look at her before going to sleep, and then subsequently finding themselves in Kronos's gut. My children, the woman, their mother, uttered. Barely audible enough to have been heard by them, almost as if she'd lost her voice. The sheer amount of emotion behind every syllable in those two words alone, however, was enough to make that small detail irrelevant, as it captured their attention completely. As the tears ran down her cheeks openly, the woman didn't bother to resist the flood of emotions that proceeded to pour out of her. You're all back, she wept, though clearly in mounting happiness as the tears continued to fall, cascading down her cheeks as a wet smile formed on her lips. You're all finally free. That we are. Beerus said evenly, grabbing the woman's attention as he stepped forward. Not letting the small amount of shock he himself felt at seeing his mother of this reality so soon after getting out of Kronos's gut keep him rooted in place. And it would appear that you have come to greet us now that we're out. Beerus, the name left Rhea's lips the instant she locked eyes with him. That one single name coming out like a whisper, as his calm amber pools and neutral expression reflected in the Titanus's dark orbs. It was around then that Zeus, Metis and Amalthea stepped into the lighter part of the cave in full view and ground themselves to a halt behind Rhea. Or rather, Amalthea stuck her arm out to stop the two from going any further, sensing that something was going on here that shouldn't be interrupted. After taking one look at her serious expression, both Zeus and Metis wisely complied and looked on. The rest of Beerus and Zeus's siblings did the same on the other side, still rooted in place from the surprise of seeing their mother again so soon. They also didn't want to step on Beerus's toes, evidenced by Hestia, who already had her own tears dripping down her face, and looked about ready to immediately move towards the mother she'd wanted to be with again. Only to keep herself rooted for the time being, as her twin got in the way. Both his expression and even his tone near impossible to read at the moment. Making it even more difficult to know what he may be thinking right now. Ah, so you can tell who I am, huh? Beerus rose a brow at that, crossing his arms behind him and hand-clasped to the other. Well, I suppose it's to be expected. You are our mother, I guess. It'd be quite shameful if you couldn't tell your own children apart. I could never forget any of your faces. Rhea replied, her voice choking up again no matter how much she tried to stop it. I have already brought shame to myself for other things in the past, but I will never add that to the list. I've been enough of a disgrace as your mother already without adding that too. Even with all the tears in her eyes, Rhea could see her own sons with perfect clarity, and it was as if she was right back to that day when her first two children had been born. The eyes of the only child who'd been conscious when Kronos had swallowed. It was impossible for her to ever forget the overwhelming feelings of sorrow and mortification, as she locked eyes with her then baby boy in that final moment before ingestion. The unmitigated look of horror in his stunning amber pools, as he stared towards her, his own mother, no doubt for help that she couldn't, give him. Why you clearly aren't all that happy to see me, my son. And I can't say I blame you for that. Rhea continued, letting out a whimper. Unlike with Hera, however, despite the mountain of guilt and negative emotions beginning to claw at her harshly, the woman refused to avert her gaze from her eldest sons even for an instant. I'm your mother, after all, and yet I failed to protect you when it mattered, all of you. She took a shaky step forward, bringing her closer to Beerus's position, now off by only a few feet. Her teary eyes glancing around, hovering over the fully grown faces of each and every one of her precious children behind him individually. Starting with Hestia, then Demeter, Poseidon, Hades, then to Hera on the other side from him, before finally coming back to Beerus. She halted in place with Beerus's next words. All of us except for Zeus, apparently. Zeus suddenly felt like a deer in the headlights, as Beerus's gaze briefly shifted over to him, before moving back to Rhea. I may not have heard it all, but I know I heard something about you managing to trick Kronos somehow into not devouring him. Care to explain why you didn't extend that same courtesy to the rest of us? It was an honest question, and one would have expected there to be some resentment in Beerus's tone when he said it. However, no one could really tell if there was or not, as the purple-haired deity managed to keep whatever emotions he may have been feeling well hidden. Beerus's next question, however, certainly drove home the fact that he might. Or was at the very least annoyed at her. Was he just more important to you than the rest of us, or something? No. The sudden, vehement shout of denial practically boomed throughout the cave. The single word holding such a level of desperate, emotive sincerity that all of the Titanus' spawn, Beerus included, were taken aback. That isn't it. I would never pick and choose like that amongst any of you. Closing the distance, Rhea took Beerus by surprise when she quickly grabbed his shoulders, though not with any kind of vice-like grip. Rather, her touch was remarkably soft and gentle, whilst still holding onto him with a firm grip that only a truly worried mother could pull off. She was a good deal shorter than he was. Just a little taller than any of his sisters at the moment as she tilted her head up to look at him, but that didn't stop her from getting so close to his face, to the point where he could see every ounce of anguish she had. Every bit of the pain and misery she felt at what she'd let happen, all of the regret and almost bone-crushing shame. All of it was on display before him up close, through both her expression and her watery pools. Seeing it all pass over her features in such a frightening storm of emotions coalescing together was enough to keep even him rooted down and speechless. Something that didn't happen often for the former God of the Erased Universe 7. My dear boy, trust me, if I thought I could get away with it, I would have done everything I could to ensure none of you ever went through what you did. I swear I would. The sheer amount of conviction and honesty in every word she spoke left no argument as to whether or not she was being genuine. You have no idea how much I wish none of this had to happen. If only for that bastard husband of mine. Beerus took notice as she grit her teeth, her agonized words at the end beginning to drip with pure venom as she brought up the father. Her body shook, as he peered into her eyes and saw nothing but revulsion and disdain at the thought of Kronos. Not even a hint of remorse for what he was doing, either to me or to you, no matter how much I pleaded with him. Tried to reason with him. He wouldn't hear any of it. He's nothing but a monster, trying to act like he's so benevolent with the idea of devouring you all. For Tartaro's sake, the only reason I was even able to trick him into eating that stone and saving Zeus was because at that point, he'd grown less and less attentive with what he swallowed. Wait, that bloody stone that landed on my head back then was Zeus's damn substitute. Beerus's eye twitched in near comical aggravation at that particular nugget. And here he'd thought that was the bastard Kronos just messing with him after that first time he'd nailed his gut. No, turns out that was just Zeus's damn stand-in. No wonder it had been dressed up in the same kind of cloth they'd all come down in. The purple-haired god was brought back to reality quick when he felt Rhea shift against him, drawing his attention back to her as her contemptuous words continued. If it hadn't been for his growing disregard for even looking at the very children he was chucking down his throat, even Zeus would have ended up in there with you too. Imprisoning you all within his stomach for all eternity. I still won't ever forget him having the nerve to say to me after first trapping you and Hestia inside of him that he considered it a mercy. A mercy. Beerus scowled at that. That piece of garbage actually thought doing that to me and them was a mercy. He knew Kronos was a greater piece of shit from the moment he'd swallowed him and Hestia whole, but to say something like that, especially to his wife, and no doubt believe it. It truly did seem as though the more he learned about their so-called father, the more and more his already rock-bottom opinion of him somehow managed to go even lower. All while his desire to brutalize and destroy him grew even higher. Mercy his ass. He'd show that fucker what he thought of that mercy when he got his hands on him again. And unlike in that castle of his, Beerus wasn't going to have his siblings to be concerned about in the crossfire. Beerus was quickly brought out of his brief reverie about what he'd inevitably end up doing to Kronos, when he felt something press into his chest. Blinking to himself as he refocused back on his mother, he saw that she'd pressed her face into it. Her divine tears staining against his tunic, something gifted to him via her magic on the day of his rebirth, as she sobbed openly. Please, I beg your forgiveness. She whimpered again, this time into his chest, further staining the tunic with her running tears, as his hands unclasped behind him. I know after what you suffered through because of my inability to act earlier, you may not believe me, but I'm sorry. To all of you. I'm so sorry. NGH, Beerus's face scrunched up as the woman finally finished speaking. Resigning herself to more quietened sobs into his chest as she wept, whilst holding on to his shoulders almost like they were a lifeline to her, though without any sort of painful grip. In truth, he admittedly had been annoyed at the woman. Not so much before, when they were still trapped in that gut, as he could tell from the situation he'd seen that she had neither a choice, nor a say in the matter of what happened to them. He wouldn't have put it past that sack of shit to put her down if she tried to save them from that fate either, as Kronos had shown him quite clearly that he only truly cared about himself. He could even put past the multiple other births and subsequent swallowing of his other siblings down the line as Kronos being a horny bastard and simply using her to satisfy himself, and then take care of the aftermath later. No. It was the fact that she'd managed to find a way to save Zeus from that fate, but not any of them, that actually gave him such annoyance towards her. Not nearly enough for him to hate her or anything, but certainly enough to get on his nerves, especially after the first impression Zeus had left on him in that castle. Now though, now that he knew how that had been accomplished, and how impractical it would have been for saving them all, he found his annoyance over it dissipating. Not to mention how he found himself cringing despite his best efforts not to, both hearing and feeling the woman cry into him after effectively pouring her heart out. Damn it all, why am I starting to feel so bad right now? He thought, not fully understanding why he felt as such, whether she was his mother in this reality or not. The lingering annoyance he had melting away quickly the longer he felt her sob into his tunic, and the more he began to feel pity for her, of all things. And, perhaps even more shockingly to him, given he'd only had about a minute of interaction with her prior to now, the sudden urge to comfort her. For goodness sake, he knew he'd mellowed out a little after all that time spent around Son Goku, but he wasn't aware it was to this extent. Damn it though, why did it have to be him doing the comforting then, huh? This wasn't his forte in the slightest. He had no real idea how to do that properly. Did he try to hug her or something? Like he'd done with Hestia before, or with Hera a little bit ago? Would that even work here with her? He hadn't the faintest clue, but he couldn't really think of anything else. Just then, as Beerus found himself once again standing around awkwardly as someone clung to him in distress, he felt a small tug on the back of his tunic. This drew his attention behind him, tilting his head to the side to glance back at the one responsible. It was Hestia yet again. This time with blasted tears of her own falling down her face as she gazed up at him with a pleading look that he could have read from a mile away, as she nodded towards their mother burying herself into his chest. It was like being stuck between a rock and a hard place, and it had to be in a situation that he wasn't, nor did he believe he ever would be, well equipped for. Made worse by the fact that all eyes were on him in expectance for his response. If his little brother Champa was still alive and could see him right now, he'd probably be rolling on the floor laughing at how he was struggling right now with something like this. And no doubt even more so if he bared witness to what Beerus did next, as he let out a resigned sigh, raising his hands up to grip on his mother's shoulders. His eyes softening as he did something you would have never caught him doing unless it involved Lord Zeno or the Grand Priest. He folded. All right. That's enough. He said in an almost exasperated tone, as he gave her shoulders a light, and hopefully comforting squeeze. I give. Please just stop it with the waterworks already. It's fine, really. We're good. We're good. She mumbled into his tunic, partially pulling her face away from it, wet with her tears, to gaze up at him. Does that mean you? Beerus's eye twitched as though he was on the brink, as he saw the look she gave him. Through all the damned sadness and distress of hers, that bloody glimmer of hope entering her gaze. Good grief, did this have to be so damn dramatic? Yes. You're forgiven. He confirmed what she'd been hoping to hear. Now, could you? Beerus was cut off before he could finish, as Rhea suddenly pushed herself up against him again, her hands leaving his shoulders as her arms seemed to wrap around his torso practically at the speed of light. He could almost feel the wind getting driven out of him as her hands planted themselves on his back and pushed his body further into hers, in a near-smothering embrace. Her ample breasts mashing into his front through her own tunic probably as much as her own face was to his right now, as she let out a shuddering cry against him. This time, however, it was not one of sorrow, but of joy one more. Thank you, my dear, sweet boy. Thank you. The expressive gratitude seemed to overflow from her in that moment, and like with Hestia, it was as if her aura burst forth from her in that moment, crashing against everyone in the cave, him especially, like a tidal wave of raw emotion. It's no issue, mother. He stuttered, completely out of his depth again. His arms eventually circling her own frame like he'd done for Hera, as he awkwardly patted her on the back. Unsure of what else to do, as he felt the unbridled force of her emotions up close as its main target right now. Goodness sake, he was starting to feel like he was little boy all over again. Being showered with that sort of unconditional affection that only a loving parent could administer. It didn't end there though, as Hestia decided she couldn't wait anymore, and joined in. Her own arms wrapping around them both, as she brought her face close to their mother's, who turned her head to loom at her eldest daughter. It's good to have you back with us, mother. She smiled brightly, her eyes overflowing with joyful tears as she hugged them both close. I missed you so much. Rhea smiled back, just as joyful as her eldest born. And are you, Hestia? My beloved daughter. One of her arms that had been around Beerus quickly snaked its way out and around Hestia, seeming to do its best to draw the woman closer to her. Oh, how I longed for the day I'd have my children back in my arms. Hey, don't go forgetting about us now, mother. Hades smirked, as he moved forward and joined in as well. The others not far behind, as each of them did forming a sort of group hug around the trio, much to Beerus's chagrin. Hey now, wait a second. There's no need for all of us to come in at once. His words went ignored, as the others tightened their embrace around them. All he could do was let out a groan, as he was forced to submit himself to the sappy family smothering. You going to join them? Amalthea asked Zeus from their position across from him, her arm having lowered as they watched the scene play out. You're a part of that family too, after all. I don't think that's necessary. Zeus waved her off, briefly casting a nervous glance at Beerus in particular. She already hugged me before in the tunnel. There's no need for me to be involved in this one. No need. The nude nymph froze a brow. You were so gung-ho earlier today about rescuing your siblings, and yet, now that you have accomplished that goal with Rhea's plan, you won't even bother to join them when they're having a family moment. Well, that's just the thing, Metis cut in, garnering Amalthea's attention. You see, things didn't really go according to plan inside of Mount Othries, Amalthea. The goat nymph blinked in confusion. What do you mean by that? Surely it couldn't have been by much, seeing as you managed to get 'em all back here. Zeus blew out a sigh. Trust me, Amalthea. Though we made it out of there together, it wasn't because of Mother's plan that we did. That kind of answer only made the nymph even more confused. But then, how did you all get out of there, if not through Rhea's plan? You may not believe us when you hear it, Zeus warned. Though I bared witness to it myself, even I'm still in disbelief of what I saw. Bared witness to what? Amalthea questioned with growing curiosity, as she saw Metis nod in agreement. Don't keep me in the dark here. If you didn't follow the plan, then what exactly happened over there to allow you both and them to have returned here safely? Well, Zeus decided to be the one to explain, leaning down his tall, muscular frame until his lips were beside Amalthea's ear, and whispered into it a quick rundown of the events that had occurred in order. After a few moments, Amalthea's eyes had widened like dinner plates and her mouth had fallen open, slack-jawed, in an expression of utter shock, as Zeus finished regaling her with the details. He really did all of that? She stuttered incredulously, as she threw her stunned gaze towards Beerus. Yes. I can promise you, he did. Zeus nodded, still not knowing himself how to process what he'd seen his elder brother do. But that doesn't make any sense. Amalthea rebuked a bit too loudly as she turned to Zeus, drawing the attention of his siblings, and more importantly, his mother, to them. Amalthea. Rhea called out with concern, hearing the nymph's outburst. The Titaness turning from her position towards the trio off to the other side, as her children parted from her to give some space. Her face no longer so raw with a myriad of emotions, as she seemed to have completely calmed herself down now, amongst the presences of her previously lost spawn. Is something wrong? Beerus rose an inquisitive brow as he glanced over and took proper notice of the other newcomer. Not just from the way that said woman looked at him funny, as though he had 10 heads, but also from the fact that she had the legs and horns of a goat. She was also completely naked for whatever reason. And didn't seem to care about that fact either. Rhea, the stunned nymph began. If what Zeus just told me is true, then I think you need to know what actually occurred up on Mount Othries. What actually occurred? Rhea blinked in confusion, as she eyed her youngest son. One who she just noticed hadn't taken part in the embrace. She could ask him about that later though. What Amalthea had just said was more important. What do you mean? Perhaps it is best if you ask your eldest son about it. She replied, motioning towards him with what had to be one of the greatest looks of disbelief and awe Beerus had ever seen on someone's face. And that was saying something, considering what his station had been for countless millions of years prior to reincarnating here. Believe me though, you'll have to brace yourself for this one. I myself can scarcely believe what I've just been told he was able to accomplish. Brace myself. Rhea turned back toward him, concerned by both the tone and words of her acquaintance. For what? Beerus, what does she mean by that? What did you do? Glancing back down at his mother, Beerus couldn't help the near-feral grin that came over him when asked that. Well, seeing as you asked. Beerus proceeded to oblige the woman's request, telling her as much as he cared to remember about what had taken place. From how he'd smashed his way out of Kronos' gut, freeing himself and his siblings in the process, to his little confrontation and skirmish with the muscle-bound moron and later with the slimmer, light-wielding Titan, and then finally, how he'd gotten them all out of the castle, where Zeus and Metis had whisked them away to the current location. As his explanation came to an end after a couple of minutes, to say that Rhea was slack-jawed at what she'd heard would be the understatement of the millennium. Her dark eyes looked about ready to bug comically out of her skull, as she openly stared in shock and awe at her son. The Titaness rendered speechless from the information that had just been divulged. Her children, sons Beerus, looked over their mother with concern of their own when she failed to muster up an immediate response. Merely maintaining her open-mouthed, wide-eyed look, as though she'd been stupefied. Finally, though, after a long moment, the Titan goddess managed to recover enough of her bearings to actually find her voice again. Her mind still struggling to process the sheer absurdity of what she'd just been informed of. Why, you really did all of that? Guilty as charged. Beerus replied smugly in some amount of satisfaction, as Rhea glanced around at her other scions as well as Metis, as though to silently ask them as well if everything he'd just said was true. None bothered to correct him on any of it. Instead, all who had been there, even Hera, nodded in acknowledgement of his tale of the events. Oh my word, this was, by Tartaros, she had no idea what to say to this. I can't believe it, you punched your way out of his gut. Yep. Why, you then proceeded to get into a fight with Atlas and then Hyperion. Well, fight is a bit of a stretch. More like he'd clapped the former and disposed of the energy beam of the latter. He'd never actually laid a hand on that annoying twat. But, more or less, yes I suppose. You then managed to escape from him, by smashing through the floor of the castle. A castle which, as she recalled, was reinforced from top to bottom, mountain included, by the divine magic of all her Titan brethren that they'd gotten away from, and he'd overwhelmed that with a single strike. Sure, it may not have been using their true divine forms that they reinforced the castle with, but even still, he'd managed to puncture through the combined protection of 5 of the original Titans in one go, and from the sounds of it, he'd taken a chunk of the mountain with him. Pretty much. Beerus nodded, beginning to look as nonchalant about it all as one could get. How? Was all she could say. Still too stunned out of her wits to think of anything else. How could you do all of that, my son? Why, you were trapped inside of Kronos all that time. How could you have amassed the power to do any of the things you've just told me? You were without guidance into the use of your abilities to even stand a fighting chance. And that was without taking into account that he hadn't a single domain to his name. You make it sound as though what I did should have been impossible. It is, Rhea tried to say resolutely, but with clear proof of the opposite in front of her in the form of her baby boy, she couldn't find the confidence for it. Or, it should be, for anyone else, managing to amass anything like the kind of power you've gained without proper guidance, and then use it to do what you've done is, impossible. Beerus chuckled lowly as he heard that. A cocky, toothy smile spreading over his face as he regarded the woman in front of him with a powerful, confident gleam in his amber pools. Well, mother, I guess you've just learned something about me right now, that I'll be sure to teach Kronos and his little group of stooges if they choose to get in my way, soon enough. A faint purple and gold aura seemed to come to life within his eyes, as though showing Rhea a glimpse inside of him into the unimaginable, divine power that dwelt within and was ready to be unleashed at his command. I am the impossible.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like this video if you want some more what if video. Comment 3 hearts for more what if.